Hi, so this video is going to be about MBTI types and whether I think they are genetic or if they're purely random or if they're based on environmental factors or if it's a combination of those. And I know that other people have done this type of video in the past. This might not even necessarily be new information for anybody, but this is just my thoughts on it, I guess. So if you're interested in that, keep watching. So kind of at a fundamental level, whether MBTI types are genetic or environmental based, it's the old nature versus nurture question in biology, which I think is a false dichotomy because it almost always is a combination of the two, because no organism, human, animal, or otherwise, exists in a vacuum. And so both genetics and the environment in which this living thing exists are going to affect what goes on with it. So therefore, obviously, it's a combination of genetics and the environment when it comes to MBTI types and cognitive functions, especially because there are obviously genetic factors at work, but then there's also childhood trauma and other adverse events, socioeconomic factors, the type of education a person receives. So those can all influence what an MBTI type is or what a person's preferred or strongest cognitive functions are, as well as the genetics that they have. So, and also there have been a lot of twin studies done with identical twins, if they're raised in different environments, and a lot of these studies haven't been done terribly recently because it's not super ethical to separate. It's not ethical at all to separate identical twins for the purposes of scientific research to see what's going to happen to one versus the other if they're in a different environment. But in situations where they are separated, there have been times when one identical twin has a mental illness and then the other doesn't, which seems to indicate that there could be an underlying genetic risk for it, and then there's something that sets it off in the environment. So, yeah. And for example, in my own family, when it comes to MBTI types and cognitive functions, there is a general trend towards there's more intuitives, I think, which is not statistically likely, but I think that's what has happened when I look at my family tree. So that there's me, I'm an INFP, and my mom, I believe, is a very unhealthy ESFJ, and my dad is also an INFP, and my brother is an ISTJ. And so, firstly, INFPs and ISTJs, they use the same cognitive functions, so they're in the same quadra. So there's that, and then the SI, being high, comes from my mother. For my brother, there's a similarity there. And then if I go a little bit further back with my grandparents, for what types I think they were, I think that my maternal grandpa was an ENTP, and I think that my maternal grandma was an ENFJ, and I think my paternal grandpa was an ISTP based on when I knew him when he was older, and what my dad has told me about how he was when my dad was growing up and everything. I think he was an ISTP. And my paternal grandmother, who I never met, unfortunately, she passed away before I was born, but I think she could have also been an ENFJ based on how my dad has described her. So it seems to be a genetic tendency towards a lot of intuitives in my family, and that just seems to be kind of the way that it is. And it seems like the people who are sensing types, they are the SJ sensors. There's like no high SE people in my family, which is interesting because we're not high energy people, which is something that I've always observed, even before I knew about MBTI and SE's very high energy, intense type. And my family is very much not like that. So this leads me to believe that there is a combination of genetic factors and the environment. And in relation to my mom, for instance, I think it's interesting that she's an ESFJ, because for a while I thought that I was an INTP, which is the opposite of an ESFJ, and so it's almost as if I subconsciously worked to be the opposite of her. So it's interesting, which is a whole nother story that I'm not going to get into. But I also think that there's a limit to environmental factors, because if an INTP is being raised by high SE users, let's say they're being raised by 2 ESFPs, that INTP is not going to turn into a high SE user. They might be a lot better at using SE than an INTP would be otherwise, but they're not going to be using it in the same way that an ESFP or an ESTP naturally would be. They're not going to use it in the same way or as well, no matter how much they're around parents who are that type. So there's a limit to how environmental factors impact people. But I think that if you look at well-known families who have a number of members who are in the public eye, you can kind of see general trends there too. For example, with the Trump family, there's a lot of high SE and high TE members of that family. From obviously, President Trump is ESTP, and then Donald Trump Jr. is ESTJ. I think the other son, Eric Trump, is ESTP, and then I think Ivanka is ESTJ as well. So there's a lot of those two that show up a lot. And I think that you can, I don't know about the Biden family, because obviously I think Joe Biden is an ESFJ, and I think that his wife Jill is ISFJ. But as far as Hunter goes, ESTP, which isn't really related to those two, but there's environmental factors and lifestyle factors for him that make him kind of obviously different from how his father acts. So you kind of have those two to compare, which is, I feel like that's kind of long-winded explanation for saying it's both, which is essentially not establishing anything. But that's my thoughts on heritability of cognitive functions and MBTI types. If you've made it this far, thank you so much for watching. I hope that you're having a good day, and I will see you later. Bye.